What are the consequences of climate change on our world? And we're going to talk about this from the standpoint of these four topics: biodiversity, food and resources, jobs and livelihood, and habitat and land use. So to start with biodiversity. So the big takeaway idea about how climate change affects biodiversity is that climate change alters environments. And when you alter environments, this can disrupt the balance of ecosystems. And an ecosystem is basically a community of living things, so animals, plants, bacteria, and so on, and where they live, their physical environment. So when an ecosystem is disrupted, this can cause things like extinction. So a good example of this is the American pika. Now the American pika is closely related to rabbits, and it lives in the American West, in high elevation alpine environments. And an alpine environment is basically a mountainous environment where average temperatures every month never go above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's pretty cold. And these animals are adapted for living in these cold conditions. Now as a result of that, they have very low heat tolerance. And what that means is if you put a pika in temperatures that are much higher than what is found in the alpine, it's not going to survive. In fact, if you put it in temperatures as mild as 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which to us is pretty comfortable, to the pika it's too warm. It's going to overheat and die in a matter of hours. Now, recently in a study conducted by Dr. Eric Beaver of the Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center, it was determined that 7 out of 25 pika populations that have been monitored in the Great Basin have gone extinct in the last 50 years. Now, why is this the case? Why is this being caused by climate change? Well, we can understand this if we kind of think how a mountain environment changes when there's warming. So we have here a hypothetical mountain, normal coolish temperatures, and at the very top, this white part is snow, and right underneath that is the alpine environment, and this is where the pikas live. Now, imagine it gets a little warmer. When it gets warmer, the snow is going to melt, the alpine environment is going to shift up with it, and now the pika can't stay where they used to live because it's too warm, so they have to run up the mountain following this alpine environment in order to survive. Now imagine it gets so warm that the snow and the alpine environment completely disappears. Well, now the pika are in trouble because there's nowhere left on the mountain that's cold enough for them to survive, and they go extinct. So now that we know how temperature plays a direct effect on pika populations, we can look at how temperatures have changed through time as a result of climate change, and look at how pika populations have responded to that. So this is a temperature curve showing how temperature has changed between 1860 and 2000. And as you can see, temperature has been steadily increasing over the years as a result of humans putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, as Kaveh mentioned. Now in 1950, there were 25 populations of pika living in the Great Basin at an average elevation of 5,700 feet. Now in 2000, there were 18 populations, so 7 of them had gone extinct. But what you should notice is that the average elevation that these animals are living at is now much higher, at 8,300 feet. So what you can see is that as temperatures are rising, not only are pika populations going extinct, those of them that are surviving are having to go further up the mountain as the alpine environment retreats as a result of warming. Now, unfortunately, if we don't do anything about climate change, this temperature is going to continue to go up as time goes on. And the alpine environments are going to continue to recede until eventually it will disappear and there won't be any pika left in North America. Now this is a problem because pika form a very important part of the mountainous alpine ecosystem in the United States. So this is a food web showing what eats what in one of these environments, and the arrow points from the thing being eaten to the thing that eats it. And what you will see is that pika form a very important food source for large predators such as falcons and eagles, coyotes, and bobcats. So even if you've never heard of the pika before, it plays a very important role in its ecosystem. And this is true for all animals, regardless of how humans actually perceive them. So when something like climate-driven extinction takes one of these animals out of these ecosystems, this can have very profound effects on the ecosystem as a whole and can even lead to things like ecosystem collapse. So now we're going to talk about food and resources, but drawing on some of the things I've already said, because a lot of our food comes from the natural environment, and thus we rely on the health of these natural ecosystems. And when climate change disrupts the ecosystems, that can have dramatic effects on where we get our food. So a good example of this is the giant jellyfish in the Sea of Japan. So the giant jellyfish is aptly named because it can grow up to 6 feet in diameter and weigh up to 450 pounds. You can see in this picture a diver right here being dwarfed next to this giant jellyfish. And recently, there's been a population explosion of these jellyfish in the Sea of Japan, and this has caused a lot of problems for fishermen who work in these waters. These jellyfish are so numerous and so large and heavy that they've been breaking nets, and there's even been a case when a 10-ton fishing trawler was capsized when the fishermen tried to bring up this net that was just teeming full of giant jellyfish. So in general, it's become very difficult for fishermen to do their job and catch what they actually want to catch, which is fish. To give you guys an idea of how much has changed, this is what a normal catch should look like, so nets and boats full of fish. This is what a lot of these new catches look like as a result of the jellyfish population explosion. You just can't throw a net down there and not come up with tons of jellyfish. Now, I say this is happening in the Sea of Japan, but jellyfish population explosions are happening all around the world. So this is not a local problem. This is very much a global problem, and one that we'll all have to deal with. Now, you might be wondering, why does warming cause jellyfish populations to explode? Well, jellyfish are kind of the opposite of pika in that they really like warm temperatures. So as the world gets warmer, more parts of the ocean get warm enough to support jellyfish populations, expanding their habitat or where they can live. In addition, as it gets warmer, it becomes warm enough for longer parts of the year for jellyfish to breed, so their breeding season gets extended. And finally, warmer temperatures actually cause the entire life cycle and reproductive cycle of the jellyfish to accelerate. What this means is that the amount of time it takes for an egg to develop into an adult jellyfish, which can then lay more eggs, is shortened when temperatures are warmer. So, in other words, you have more places to live, more time to breed, and a shorter development time. All these cascading effects result in there being lots and lots of jellyfish. Now, lots of jellyfish isn't just a problem because it makes it physically harder to fish. It's also a problem because jellyfish, just like anything else, need to eat, and jellyfish eat plankton. So when there are giant populations of jellyfish, they're eating up lots and lots of plankton. Now, plankton are microscopic organisms that are found everywhere in the ocean, and they form the foundation of the ocean ecosystem. What that means is that everything in the ocean either eats plankton, or eats something that eats plankton, or eats something that eats something that eats plankton, and so on. So here's an example food web. Starting from the left, we have plankton here. We have shrimp that eat plankton, herring that eat shrimp, tuna that eat herring, and then killer whales that eat tuna. So what you can see is that everything in the ocean relies on plankton, whether directly, like the shrimp, or indirectly, like the killer whale. So when something happens to plankton populations, everything above it is going to be affected as well. So when you have these giant jellyfish populations eating up as much plankton as they can, that leaves less plankton in the ocean for everything else that relies on these very important foundation species. And this whole problem is made worse by the process of ocean acidification. Now, ocean acidification happens when human factories pump out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Some of it ends up into the ocean, and it combines with water in the ocean to form what is called carbonic acid. Now, this is actually the same thing that happens when you carbonate sodas with carbon dioxide, which is why they say that if you drink too much soda, your teeth will rot. Now, as we put more and more carbon dioxide into the ocean, it's producing more and more carbonic acid. More and more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it produces more and more carbonic acid in the ocean, thus increasing the acidity of the ocean. And this is a problem because acid corrodes the shells and bodies of very many marine organisms, including those very important foundation species like plankton, but also things like coral, shrimp, krill, lobster, clams. Basically anything in the ocean that has a shell is adversely affected by ocean acidification. And as an example, you can see here on the right, we have a healthy sea urchin. On the left, we have a sea urchin that's been grown in very high carbon dioxide waters. And as you can see, it hardly has any spines because it's been corroded by the acid. So in summary, you can see here in this ocean food web, these problems that I've talked to you about, these exploding jellyfish populations, this problem of ocean acidification, these all directly and adversely affect foundation species like plankton, but also things like coral, shellfish, and krill. And this is a problem because, well, for one, we eat a lot of these things, most notably shellfish, but we also eat animals that rely on these animals, such as tuna and cod and salmon and anchovy. So climate change is allowed to continue unabated, and these processes are allowed to continue to wreak havoc on the ocean. Pretty soon we're not going to be able to eat things like clam chowder and fish and chips anymore, because there just won't be a healthy enough ocean to sustain our level of consumption. So now that you know how climate change can affect ecosystems and thus in turn our food and resources, you can probably imagine how it affects our jobs and livelihood as well, because someone has a job to go out there and catch fish and shellfish for us to eat. But just how much does it affect our jobs and livelihood? So in 2006, U.S. commercial recreational fishing generated more than $185 billion in sales and supported more than 2 million jobs. Now that's a lot of money and a lot of jobs, and it isn't just the United States that has such a large stake in the health of our oceans. This is a chart showing exports from developing countries in 2002, and what you will see is that in 2002, developing countries made more money from exporting fish than they did from exporting coffee, cocoa, and bananas combined. So fish is obviously a very important commodity for these developing economies. In fact, all over the world, more than 500 million people make their livelihood off of harvesting the oceans. And 16% of the world's total consumed animal protein comes from the ocean, and this percentage is actually higher in countries like China and Japan and Egypt and Peru. So as you can see, fish is a very important thing for our global economies and for our global livelihoods, and thus it's very important that we try to maintain the health of the ocean, even though climate change is working against that. So now we're going to talk about something a little different. We're going to talk about the direct physical effects of climate change by looking at how it affects human habitat and land use. So this is the Earth, and what you'll notice about this Earth is that it has ice on it. Now this is something that we kind of take for granted. You know, we all love animals that live on the ice, like polar bears and penguins and seals and so on, but the world doesn't always have ice on it, as a matter of fact. About 50 million years ago, during a time that geologists call the Paleocene, there was no ice on the Earth. And to give you guys an idea of when this was pretty soon after the dinosaurs went extinct. Now, what you'll notice about this Earth is that a lot of land that's above water today was underwater during this time. And the reason for this is when you have big ice caps, ice is just frozen water. So when you have ice caps, it's ice being taken out of the ocean and frozen in solid form as an ice cap. Now, that causes sea levels to go down. Now, when all that ice melts and goes back into the ocean, sea levels will rise. Now, our ice is currently melting, and we're on our way to a world without ice. So this is a diagram showing the extent of the Arctic ice sheet between 2003 and 2010, where the white represents where the ice is more than 3 feet thick, and the light blue represents where the ice is less than 3 feet thick. And what you'll notice is between 2003 and 2010, the amount of ice has been steadily decreasing, but most importantly, the amount of thick ice has been decreasing very dramatically. We've lost around 50% of our thick ice, leaving behind this thin ice, which is very susceptible to permanent melting. Now, as this ice is melting, and will continue to melt, sea level is rising and will continue to rise. Based on current projections, if climate change continues the way that it has been, by 2100, sea level will rise by 2 feet 7 inches to 6 feet 6 inches or more, or about the equivalent of 1 Kobe Bryant in sea level. Now, you might think 6 feet, that's not that much. I mean, Kobe Bryant is tall, but he's no Yao Ming. But 6 feet is actually something to get very worried about. So this is a map showing how many people in America live on lands below 4 feet in elevation. In other words, these are the people whose homes will be completely underwater if sea level rises by a mere 6 feet. And you'll see there are more than 2 million people in Florida, 1 to 2 million in Louisiana, lots more in California, New York, Virginia, but also lots of states like Connecticut. In fact, nearly 5 million Americans live on lands below 4 feet in elevation. And it isn't just people's homes that are in trouble if sea level continues to rise, it's also energy facilities. You'll see all these orange dots on here. There's 287 of them to be precise. These are all energy facilities on the continental United States that are also below 4 feet in elevation. Now, to give you guys an idea of how much of a problem this is, some of you may remember the earthquake that hit Japan last year, and if you do, you might have heard of the Fukushima nuclear energy disaster. And basically what happened there was a nuclear power plant built very close to the coast, and when the earthquake happened, there was a tsunami that flooded this power plant. And it flooded, the flooding caused it to be cut off from the power grid, the reactor cores were flooded, and this led to nuclear meltdown, which of course caused a lot of problems. Problems that we're going to have to think about for all these power plants if sea level continues to rise, which it will unless we do something about climate change. So now I'm at the end of my talk, so just to recap for you guys, Kaveh talked to you guys about why climate change is happening, why humans' activity is behind it. I've talked to you guys about the effects of climate change, some of the effects, and I hope I've given you guys an idea of why this is a very serious issue and why we really need to do something about it unless we want these problems, which are already affecting us, to become even worse. And for the last part of our talk, John will be talking to you guys about what are some of the things we can possibly do about climate change and to try and solve these problems.